Hey everyone, welcome to D-News Plus again today. I am Trace, and this is episode 1 of 5 in our new series on monsters. Yeah, I know we just did paranormal, but there's a lot more science to monsters than you think. This week we're gonna look into what monsters are, where they came from, how they showed up in nature, but also in biology and in disease and history and culture, and why we're still afraid of monsters, even today in the era of technology. The term monster was actually thrown around kind of a lot. You know, there's monsters under the bed, there's monsters in movies, there's, people who have done bad things, they're called monsters. When people are different, they're called monsters. Something in nature that is big and dangerous is usually called a monster. Also, things that are dangerous or big separately are sometimes called monsters. But what are they really? So to figure it out, let's go back to the beginning, the etymology of the word monster. Etymology is one of our favorite things on D-News Plus. If you aren't aware, etymology, actually the etymology of etymology is it's the study of word origins. So it comes from the etymo meaning true and logos meaning word. Just a little fun fact for you. So, monster comes from the root words of monere, which is to warn, the Latin of monstrum, or abnormal shape. The 12th century, there was this old French word, monstre, which is a prodigy or a marvel. In the 13th century, monster was a disfigured person or misshapen thing. And in the 14th century, it was malformed, came to a birth defect. By the 1520s, the word monster was used for an animal of vast size. So over time, the term has changed. So like in our paranormal episode, there are a lot of things that can be monsters or monstrous, and we are going to talk about all of them, and some of them are real. Most definitions of monsters come back to that feeling of abnormal, something being abnormal, different. So a long time ago, when we didn't really know that much about the world, when monsters would be brought up, the idea was, grab your pitchfork and a torch and get out there. We gotta kill them, we gotta banish them. We put them on display if we can capture them, and sometimes we'll use those monsters to teach a lesson, which I think is actually the most interesting part. Just as paranormal can't exist without science, monsters, in the sense of them being abnormal, can't exist without defining normal, right? So until we have a definition of what is normal, how can you decide something is different? Humans created monsters. We created the idea of normal, and thus we created the idea of abnormal. So when something comes along that doesn't fit our preconceived notion of what normal is, we label that thing a monster. And it has a lot to do with just not understanding it. In ancient times, monsters were really just the unknown. The world's a big place. There's lots of things that you don't understand. And, before the internet, before modern science, there was less information available to the average person. And so when you went out and explored the world, you would see something you don't know, and then you might end up just coming up with an idea about what it probably is, and then that launches a monster. For example, a cool ancient beast that if you've ever played any video game, you've probably heard of in the fantasy realm, a griffin. It's the head of an eagle and the body of a beast. And they think that the griffin may have come from the bones of a protoceratops, which is a dinosaur with a beak. It has 4 legs, a fairly thin, bony body, and elongated shoulder blades, which can give the impression of wings. There are actually fossils of protoceratops all around the Gobi Desert. And usually those fossils are underground. Obviously, you have to dig down to get to them. But in places, there's sand that has eroded away and shown those fossils just on the surface. And that could have perpetuated the myth of griffins. Super interesting, right? Because a lot of this had to come from somewhere. There was a time we didn't know that there were dinosaurs underneath our feet. We didn't know it was under there at all, so when we started seeing them, we had to get an explanation. Another ancient monster was the Cyclops, which likely came from fossils of ancient elephants, the Dinotherium giganteum, translated to really huge, terrible beast. And it's one of the largest mammals ever to walk the earth, and it was found on the Greek islands of Crete. What a coincidence. Ancient Greeks found these skulls and they used them to help prove myths of giant monsters who were fighting gods and titans. And the hole in the skull of this giant elephant would have been where the trunk would come out, but it was misinterpreted as an eye hole because there's not a lot of elephants in Greece. So they didn't really have anything else to compare it to. And thus, you have a Cyclops skull and not a giant ancient elephant skull. Again, the world was big and mysterious, and we couldn't just Google something. So when it came to learning what these things probably were, somebody had to travel to where elephants were, write them down, describe them, ideally do some scientific study on them, and then come back and share that knowledge with everyone else, word of mouth or via a book if somebody could read and have access to that information. Of course, books didn't even come around for another few hundred years. There are existing scientific records that prove that monsters were often accepted as science in that exact way. Because the problem is, even men of science and women of science back in history were susceptible to these stories because not everybody had all the information. One of the most famous books is by a man named Pliny the Elder. It's a natural history from 77 or 79 AD. The man lived in the south of Italy, very close to Mount Vesuvius, and he talked about things like the unicorn, the body of a horse, the head of a stag, feet of an elephant, tail of a boar, and a single black horn. He also wrote about forest dwellers with backwards feet and a race of men with no mouths, dragons and animal-man hybrids, and he described a fish that could hold a ship still with just the suction of its mouth. And they all sound like monsters, and they were written in these, natural history books by Pliny the Elder, but there were probably just second and third hand versions of stories and misinterpretations handed to him by other people. They were recorded by a respected man, one of science, and thus from his word came these monsters. And they were backed up by science, by his observations, and thus became fact. Monsters, though, were not just born out of tall tales told around, the pub or whatever. They were also born out of lessons, out of fear, out of learning things, or controlling a population. Many times, fear of the unknown, but also fear as a way to teach people. Again, the world was big. We didn't know what was going on, but we were out there exploring it and trying to figure out more stuff. And on ancient maps, there were unknown parts of the world. And I think everybody knows what that means. That means there's a dragon there, right? Or a sea serpent, or a monster of some kind. Here there be dragons, because people were afraid. They didn't want to go out into the open sea. They don't know what's out there. Most sailors don't like, at this period, to leave sight of land if they can help it, because how are you going to navigate? You have to have this complicated navigation system using the stars. You need to be learned enough to understand that. So not everybody could do that. So why would you sail out into the middle of nothing? There must be something that you're afraid of out there to keep people from doing that. You don't want to be afraid of nothing, just water, whales. There's also the ancient Norse myth of dwarfs howling, and that was how they described the sounds of a volcanic eruption, because they didn't understand what was happening, but they needed to explain it. We have this pathological need to explain the world, not just experience it, but to explain it. In the Congo, the Mbuti tribe used monsters to make villagers not want to go into the forest. The Yanomami people in the Amazon rainforest talked of water monsters, which would convince villagers in their village not to visit another rival village. They used monsters to provoke fear. Fear will keep the local systems in line. Fear of this battle, or monsters, whatever. You get it. There are tales also that are used for good. It's not just stay away from those rival tribes and don't sail into the open ocean. It's also, behave, children. Santa Claus, one could argue, is a monster. Somebody who's always watching you and always, abnormally there, knowing everything you do and determining whether or not you were good or not. If you don't like me saying Santa is a monster, sorry. How about the Krampus then? That's another monster. It's something that's still used today, very popular on the internet. But there's examples in Aboriginal culture as well of adults telling children that there is a man who's 4 feet tall with a big head, mouth, and throat and no teeth, and it swallows children whole if they misbehave. How many stories have you heard that were told to children to get them to behave? Think about Little Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel. These are fables so that children know not to wander off, not to talk to strangers, not to trust when they shouldn't. They're ways to teach us using monsters. Old agricultural societies had children working in fields alone or staying home while their parents would work. So monster tales were ways to keep them from straying from the home without having to explain the complications of a society that they live in, ad nauseum anyway. So there are fables and lessons to using monsters. Another use for monsters is to keep people alive. There are tales from Inuit villages and from Greenland of ogre women who try and steal children who cry in villages that were hiding from attackers. This would help keep children silent during those attacks so that the ogres didn't steal the children, or so they thought. But really, it was helping keep people safe. There are also examples of monsters in rural communities, monsters that help keep children wary of dangerous mountain terrains, unsafe lakes, getting lost in the woods, venturing out alone, trying to help people follow the rules of their society. There's not a lot of studies to see how this worked across these ancient cultures, but it's neat to think about how these tales of monsters actually are useful and could be some reason that we believe these things and they carry through today because it helped us not do something dangerous. I feel like the Grimm brothers were all over this. There are also examples in religion. We haven't talked too much about it. I don't want to get too much into that, but that's a big part of it too. The devil and demons and vengeful gods, they're monsters that keep people from sinning. They keep people in line in the same way as any other lesson in fable. In Judaism, they have golems to help in a time of crisis. The Hindu religion has rakshasas, a shape-shifting goblin. And, there are all these different things that are created as abnormal, dangerous beings that we call monsters, but they're being used to keep people in line. Monsters are just the best, and if you want more, you can tune into Animal Planet because Monster Week is going on this Thursday at 9/8 Central. What monster did you believe in when you were young? Did you have a monster that you believed in? Personally, aliens. I was really worried about aliens, a lot. Way more than I probably should have, living in the middle of Michigan. There'd be no reason for aliens to come and steal me out of my room, but I was afraid of them nonetheless. Let us know in the comments. Make sure you come back tomorrow for more D News Plus, because tomorrow we're going to talk a bit about how nature has created some real monsters. So tune in for that. I'm Trace. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.